time is something that most fields don't get to until they sort of, gain enough courage or craziness to tackle.
Right.
But it's so, so fundamental to the broad principles of organization of the brain.
I'm John Foxe, Director of the Monte Institute for Neuroscience here at the University of Rochester, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Neuroscience Perspectives. I'm absolutely thrilled today to introduce my guest, Dr. Nobre. Dr. Nobre is the Director of the Center for Neurocognition and Behavior at the Wu Tsai Institute at Yale University. She recently returned to her alma mater after spending the majority of her career at Oxford University, where she held several major leadership roles, including the director of the Oxford Centre for Human Brain Activity. She is an international member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the British Academy, and she has received numerous honours, including Lifetime Mentor Award from the Association for Psychological Science, the MRC Suffrage Science Award, the Broadbent Prize from the European Society for Cognitive Psychology, and the D. Carvalho Heineken Prize for Cognitive Neuroscience. Her discoveries have literally revolutionized our understanding of human brain and behavior. So thank you, Dr. Nobre, for being here on Neuroscience Perspectives with us. Let's dive in. Let's dive straight in with your research. We've known each other quite some time, and actually we do stuff in the same kind of vein. So I have been a huge fan, and I've followed your work for, I shouldn't say decades, but it is decades.
Decades.
We've been around
Likewise,
a while, unfortunately.
Yes.
So, and I always think of you as an attention researcher, but you've really spanned the gamut, looking at sort of the role of cognition in determining behavior. And one specific area is this business of time and attention or cognition in time and frameworks of time. So why time, and why is it so important?
I'm voraciously curious about the brain, always have been, as long as I can remember. And when I was a graduate student, I didn't know what I was going to do. Am I going to do cellular, molecular, systems level, human stuff? So I'm really curious about the whole breadth of it. And so I kind of found a trick, which is to study some things that are relevant to everything, right. So that I can kind of dabble in understanding, ultimately trying to pick up the broad principles of organization of the brain. So in my sort of way of thinking about attention, it's really maybe not about our colloquial definition of it, but it's really about how the brain picks out the relevant information out in the world and how it does that proactively, dynamically as we're moving around the world. Meanwhile, how it's putting all those signals together, how it's putting away other things, and all of this is also happening through time. Mm-hmm. And I think the time is something that most fields don't get to until they sort of gain enough courage or craziness to tackle.
Right.
But it's so, so fundamental to the broad principles of organization of the brain. So for me, studying attention and studying attention in a dynamic, temporally structured, proactive way is a way of kind of carving out the core principles of brain organization.
Right. And it goes back to this idea of a limited resource, right? There's only so much you can take on at any given time, which is kind of how I think most of the field think about it, right? I'm going to attend over here, not over there. I'm going to attend to red and not blue, and so on. And those are in instantaneous time. And so you've said, I need to understand this as it plays out across an episode or a period.
I think that framing that you gave is the textbook framing of the field. We have limited resources, there's bottlenecks, and it kind of emphasizes sort of the limitations of our mental capacity in our brain. I like to think about it a different way. I think that actually the brain is pretty clever of trying to pick out the right things in order to plan for adaptive behavior. So it's kind of always ahead of the game in picking out things to do, as far as it can tell, what's going to be the right thing next. So I kind of think of this idea of picking out information as a positive, constructive, proactive thing for guiding behavior, right. rather than because we have these limited resources. And I also think that, that kind of framing of the limited resource doesn't really tell us anything about how it works. So I think it's true that there are some limitations in the brain, but we should think about how do they come about? What kind of nature are they, and how does that? So I think a lot of it is, we pick up the world through, our different, quite restricted sensors. Then we split out that information into lots and lots of different features. They're all rumbling around the brain at different, times and looping around.
Right.
And somehow we have to put that all together. So I think the constraints are really about like when there's overlap of information on hitting on the same cells, how do the cells know who to connect to? And it's not about that there's just too much. It's like it's the problem of stitching it all together again.
Right.
That I think is the tough bit.
Does it go hand in hand with, so theories come and go in our field, and we're all about predictive coding at the moment.
Yeah.
This idea of having like a model
Yeah.
that and projecting out into the future. Is it related to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, attention research has been looking at that stuff for a long time, and I think predictive coding, so I don't want to badmouth predictive coding. I love predictive coding colleagues, but, predictive coding has come in as almost like a new framework.
But it's an old idea dressed up.
Yeah, and I think the two fields could do better at finding the points of conciliation, convergence, mutual information. So I think a lot of the predictive coding literature has emphasized the fact that, if you already know something, then you don't actually need to process it because you kind of filter it out and you just process the things you don't know. Whereas the attention literature tells you exactly the opposite.
Right,
it says if you know things, you can put them to really good use and do that thing to the best of your ability. Like if you're in a tennis game or marathon and having to figure out. I think that both of those things are probably correct, and they happen probably in different circumstances, within different mechanisms, and possibly within different circuits. But I think sometimes the predictive coding has kind of swept the attention field under the carpet, and I think it would be much better if we bring all those threads together and build a better tapestry out of it.
Tell me something that you've learned about a mechanism that keeps track or divvies out my resources in this temporal way over time. Would you have a simple answer to that, or is that an impossible question?
I'm not sure what you mean, but I mean, I think we can read out the fact that the brain is pre-playing things in time.
Right.
We can read these things out, we can read out like what you're focusing in mind based on what you're going to have to retrieve all the way to your eyeballs by measuring your pupil. We can look at how the brain is selectively focused on the information it's going to need to retrieve at a given moment.
Right.
And we can measure that from your eyes, for example, which is pretty crazy.
So seeing the signals in neuron circuits using electrophysiology or imaging and saying, this area.
And even physiological signals all the way to,
and the periphery.
Right.
And is that, do oscillations, for example, as part of a temporal, a way to hold on to time?
Yeah.
Is that a player in this?
There are a lot of potential players in time processing at the moment, and I don't think we have a consensus, broad understanding of which of the many potential mechanisms that might be contributing to this. So, for example, there are oscillations. Oscillations have been proposed as keeping beats and keeping tempos and possibly structuring a bit of our active sensing of the world.
Right.
There are also activity in neurons that ramp up to anticipated moments. There are dynamical systems that are, very dynamical, and that at given moments of time, if something happens that's important, you get a plasticity event, which then consolidates that state, which intrinsically carries time information in it. So there are lots and lots of different types of potential time contributing mechanisms, and I think a really big challenge for the field is going to be to try to understand, do all of these happen? Are some of them incompatible with each other? Do some serve certain purposes or others? And I don't think that we'll, John, you and I, we're not going to be able to do this only with the human methodology.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to take a concerted effort of colleagues working across scales, all the way to some of the cellular mechanisms, but also, very importantly, like the animal models, circuit models, try to put it all together.
Very good. So, I'm going to pull back up a little bit. Okay. I recently saw you giving the Fred Kavli Distinguished Contributors Award lecture at the Cognitive Neuroscience meeting in Toronto. Oh, okay. I was out there in the adoring crowd, and I was really struck by what you did there was, you pulled back and did one of those 30,000-foot sort of career things, and a number of things you said there struck me. One was you talked about us as a young, immature field.
Yeah.
And another thing you said was, we've gone down many cul-de-sacs. You've having a sort of front row view from really the very early days of cognitive neuroscience. So two questions for you there. Are we still young? Are we maturing? Is there a lesson to be learned about ways that going forward we don't track ourselves down these cul-de-sacs? Do you have an insight on that, now that you're in this really enormous leadership role?
Yeah, thank you for that question. First of all, I really agonized about whether I should give that kind of talk or whether I should just talk about, the trajectory of my own science.
Yeah.
I feel like some of those messages are important enough to me that I thought, maybe it was important to say them out loud and not just to my people in my own research group.
Right. I know the audience appreciates that. And maybe that actually goes to the immaturity pieces. We need the foundational people in the field to step up now and really take that longer view and say, like, what are we doing here? And are we really approaching these questions in the right way? I mean,
I think we are in an amazingly exciting time. I mean, in our careers, we've seen all of the human neuroimaging methodology emerge, and it keeps it keeps transforming and advancing at a relentless pace. And we've learned a lot really very, very fast. And I think the thing which naturally we're swept away by how much we've learned and how smart we are and how much smarter we are than we were 10 years ago and stuff. But I would say that, we are crawling as a science. First of all, a point that I made I just mentioned this and I didn't talk about it in my talk, is that our science had a really tough genesis. People did not believe that you should or could understand the subjective mind. You can understand the brain, the organ, but actually understanding cognition was not something that people thought should happen necessarily in the 1800s and 1700s. So if you read some of the original papers of some of those pioneers, like, Wundt, for example, or Helmholtz, those people were fighting deep prejudice to sort of, create, psychophysics and psychophysiology and all these different approaches that we have today. So we started late. We started much later than most other sciences. And the mind is hard, it's subjective. It's crazy stuff to try to get a hold of. We have to triangulate it. You have to get it through behavior, through brain. You can't measure it necessarily directly. So you have to kind of approach it. So it's a hard science. And I think if you look at the state of our field, we still kind of, really the grounding start point for most people is just intuition. How do we think? We make a decision, we have this choice or that choice. It's very much folk psychology, intuition still grounding us. We don't have like a formal language of the field. And I think we're doing really well. I don't think we're immature. I think we're young.
Yeah. So would you mean things like, we have these this sort of taxonomy of terms,
we don't even have a good taxonomy yet, we don't
attention. And I know you think we may need to really re-examine those
Absolutely.
concepts.
I think
constructs.
I think many of those things will probably, if we're successful, many of those things are going to be radically transformed, and we will have a different understanding. It could be, that it's more of an evolutionarily rooted thing. It could be, that we focus more on the senses and sensory motor anchors, or I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think we're still carrying a lot of folk psychological baggage with us. So I think we are in the stage, like kind of the Aristotelian/Newtonian phase of like, we kind of use common sense, observation, intuition, but we have amazing measuring tools and they keep getting better and better. We can quantify and measure and relate, but we haven't kind of gotten to that core theoretical principles. We're not like where some of the quantum physics and some of the other more advanced
And would you
sciences
say in some ways those are advanced science because the questions themselves are more tractable? Does it go back to that business of complexity?
I think that's part of it. Obviously the universe is also very complex, and the mind is only one part of it. But I think complexity matters, and also the fact that the mind is still I would say, the biggest, mystery in the universe still.
Yeah, certainly.
So I'm looking forward to things getting really crazy, So, and I think you said that, how do we avoid cul-de-sacs? I think the other thing is, one thing our psychology has been really good at is kind of revealing to us what social animals we are. So, everything we do is social, political, and we work as kind of tribes, our labs and things. So I say, oh, look, John Foxe is doing this. Oh, I don't think he used the right interval. I'm going to do it right. So we end up kind of, creating little cottage industries of working on, and we're working on these, there's a big territory
can
out
get
there.
A little esoteric sometimes,
Yeah,
arguing
it gets
over
esoteric,
intervals.
And we build like very crowded neighborhoods of research, and then other vast, interesting landscapes are left open. So the thing I try to do is just always like know your stuff, bring some scholarship along, but just look at it with really open eyes, curiosity. Look at it for what's out there, is this, question everything. So I think, it doesn't always work, but it kind of helps you getting, stuck in like, fashion corners of the field, I think.
Absolutely. So, and then projecting out, like if you were giving some advice to the younger, obviously you do this all the time with your graduate students and trainees and that, what do you say to them about that, like getting unstuck or framing out the questions in a way that will make them meaningful and important?
Yeah, I sometimes feel for people in my lab because, I really push them hard to make their own decisions and really to think like, is this really interesting to you? Do you care about this? Do you, what do you think's going to, how is this going to change the way you think about things? Is this going to change our understanding of things? I really try to operate at that very basic low level where I think things are really important. So I really try, and I think, there are many ways to be a successful mentor, but sort of my approach is really to try to help each individual find meaning and joy and their own, pathway of the balance of productivity for themselves. So I try not, I'm not one of those things like everyone has to do this every month and here we do, it's all very
more organic.
It's kind of intense
holistic.
And organic,
working on personhood as well as just this is the great project
and
to
not
do or
just
something.
The person as a scientist, but the whole person. I mean, I think you're only going to do great science if you're really happy and if it fits in your life. So
that's very good. And of course, you had some extraordinary mentors. I had the great privilege of knowing two of your foundational mentors, Greg McCarthy and Truett Allison. Can we talk a bit about that, like the mentorship in your life and maybe some people that lifted you up and framed the way you approach things?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I've been so lucky. I've had pretty much only support and, championing and enthusiasm from people I've worked with. Of course, everybody's weird and, quirky from close up, and you have to embrace the quirks of your mentor.
Especially in our business.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I just always try to take the best out of people. So Truett Allison, who, as you know, is now passed. I mean, he was one of the very modest giants in the field. I remember him singing, country music, and I can't actually sing some of the songs because they're not repeatable in public. And, he's a super funny guy, and
he was such a good man.
And he was part of the beatnik generation, traveling around in his convertible in the 50s or. But his mentor and he were the people who turned squiggly lines into ERPs, event-related potentials, and then Greg, super methodical, brilliant. Like he was really cared about the big conceptual questions and trying to get the best out of the methods and really always pushing the methods. He was, at Yale at the time when there was like the rumblings of the big MR revolution. He was the one who really initiated like the first cognitive study with using, non-invasive MRI, and he had made, all the connections with all the biophysics and the biochemistry and the physics guys and brought the monkey people together, and, he had that kind of entrepreneurship and methodological initiative, which he still has. So actually one of the best things, so it's a bit of a tangent, but going back to Yale after 30 years at Oxford is reuniting with Greg, because Greg also had left and now he's back there. The other thing that Truett was amazing about is, I mean, he didn't do this explicitly. It was just him. He just created such an amazing culture. So we all had lunch together all the time, and he had funny championships that he would put up and competitions, all about, non-scientific things sometimes. And then he had the Secret Santa party, which we all gave each other silly anonymous gifts and teased each other. He created diplomas for people who left the lab, which were kind of based on people's features and traits, which I still do. I still carry those traditions till now. And so so actually when I left Oxford, now my whole lab gave me my Oxford diploma, and they're all just poking fun at each other and not taking ourselves too seriously.
All about that sort of generating a culture in the lab that makes people, I know there's a lot of buzzwords these days, like safe and secure. But a culture that doesn't make people feel like they have to produce something, positive results we talk about in that, but that you're there to be part of an adventure to get to the truth, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that was the most scary thing for me moving over after 30 years at Oxford, is whether I would be able to re-establish the kind of lab that I still have. Some people are still in Oxford now, because the lab that I have is like amazing. And it's first of all, it's flat. It's everybody counts. Everybody is, as valuable as anybody else in that lab. Obviously, everyone will have different contributions, different levels of knowledge, different skills. So we kind of respect each other's qualities and also our defects. We all have defects as well. But it is a lab where I try to create a space where we can be honest scientists. We can kind of, tell each other like when something is amazing, when something is not quite there yet, and just be open. And when, I always celebrate like unexpected results and mistakes, because that's where we learn from. And we have a very safe lab, but safe in a very different way, I think, than how people tend to use it now. It's not like we're not challenged. We challenge ourselves all the time, but we challenge ourselves in a supportive, honest environment where we're all just trying to be the best we can.
You're an electrophysiologist first, right? And so you're squiggly lines and high temporal precision. And then along came fMRI, and you and I both had the great good fortune of being right there when this all happened. So I often wonder actually about our youngsters, are they going to have the same opportunity? There is a big happenstance component to it. But when you see all this work now using functional imaging, where they're talking about temporal correlations between areas, and we're really still looking at the brain plumbing, do you think about this? The tension between what you know about timing, given that time is so important to you, from electrophysiology, and the way this is talked about with the functional imaging folks.
Absolutely, and I think I touched on that in that Kavli lecture, and that was one of the things I was hesitant to mention. I tried to couch it in a friendly way, I think ultimately the brain is working at a very maybe not super fast way, because it's still biology, not compared to electricity and stuff, but things are happening in the tens and hundreds of millisecond scales. The MR-based and PET-based imaging are much, much slower. They're kind of looking at the multiple downstream consequences of that neural activity, and not even in a necessarily one-to-one way, right? So we don't even know exactly what's all contributing to the hemodynamic response. So the thing that baffles me is that people actually use imaging to say, like, what is this area doing? You can't ask that question.
That's right.
Because, what you're going to see in an MR image is all the activity that's going through that area as part of the network that this area is in. And you don't know what the contribution of that area is, or what's the feedback to that area, what's the reentrant stuff, what's the lateral connection. So that really, worries me. And I've actually, and that's, I would say, now I think people are using MR also for many other different types of questions, some of which I think are great and fine. But I think the bulk of the MR work is still about, what's this area doing? And not only do we now just look at an activation, is we also throw in really complex, computational equations to understand exactly what factor of this process is. And I think that's even more crazy because, I think, so I actually worry that, we are creating a sort of a hallucinogenic kind of view of what the brain is doing based on MR.
Precisely the same worry, because in the end of the day, when you go back to first principles, we're looking at fluid dynamics in a tissue system, compartmentalized tissue system, but they by definition are slower than the actual events of interest to us.
Yeah.
And there is no amount of speeding up of the capture of the data that's going to change that fact. The signal is the signal. Yeah, so that does worry me. I mean, I still think there are lots of amazing things that MR can do. So I think, if you're just trying to understand in general, are areas correlated with each other? That's good, because it doesn't really matter the fine grain. Right. So you can kind of get the broad networks, maybe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think if you want to say, if you want to say, I can see that the brain is coding this kind of information, or some area has that kind of information by using decoding methods, or compare this kind of representation versus that representation, or the transformations of representation. I think that's okay, as long as you're not trying to pin it down to a specific. So I think there are lots of good questions that people can ask, but I think, as usual, having that respect for the limitations of the methods often falls short. It also falls short in our area. I mean, to be honest, I think, when I remember when I went to Oxford initially, I was trying to set up the sort of first EEG and ERP lab there. And what everybody wanted to do is I want to know what this area is doing at what point in time. I said, well, you can't really ask that question with EEG, because we don't have that kind of spatial resolution or pinpointing. So again, we can ask lots of interesting questions, but there are some that are not as well answered. And
beyond
it's
the resolution of the technique.
And those, for some reason, because I guess ultimately humans are phrenologists at heart, maybe phrenology and space and time, those are the things that they want to ask, and the methods don't really allow us to ask those things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So let's go back a bit then. Let's go way back. You're not from these shores. You were born in Brazil. There's a couple of things I want to ask about that. So how does a girl from Brazil end up in the US, and how does a girl growing up the way you did end up thinking, I want to be a neuroscientist?
Yeah, so I think, life is full of coincidences and circumstances, and I think those make a huge difference to people's lives. I was a small kid in Rio, in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and my parents were very young, so they were sort of in their early 20s when they had me. And my mom convinced my dad that he should go and do a course. Let's go and travel abroad, and why don't you go and do a course in the States? So so that was kind of unheard of at that time in Rio and stuff. And they didn't come from very rich families or anything. So my dad was a very good student, and he got a fellowship, and we ended up. He spent a little bit of time at Princeton and NYU doing was doing law. And that's when I was in my real formative years. I was 4 to 6.
Right, okay.
So, that's
so
kind of where all my...
you were put into school then?
I went into an international school, like the United Nations school, which was amazing because I met, friends from all over the world. I had my best friends were from Kenya and Peru and Canada.
Wow. And
so we all had our little flags, in our different countries. That was a blast. That was amazing. It was also during... the hippie years, so you go outside, everyone's dropping LSD, and there was the Black Panther movement. It was a really crazy time in New York City. So those were very vivid memories. When we went back to Brazil, my parents realized that I had this great gift that I spoke English, perfectly, and they thought that this would be a good thing for me. So they kind of convinced the American school there to let me in on a scholarship to continue studying and in being able to speak English. And then that school, was a great school, again, with people from all over the world landed in Rio. You can imagine, people from all kinds of corners, from the Netherlands and Cape Town and, everywhere. And so I grew up in this very international community, but the school was very good at sort of preparing us. And, their aim was to get us to the American, Ivy Leagues kind of thing. And at that point, I had a really big young life crisis, because I wanted to go to the States. My dad was like, you can't do this. If you leave Brazil now, you're never going to come back. And we'd have these many hours long every day discussions about this and stuff. And in the end, I had decided that I wasn't going to come to the States. And I didn't actually, I threw out a lot of my college applications, but I had applied to some places still. So I got into those places, and then I ended up in the most bizarre place for me, which was a wonderful place, but I ended up in Williams College, which is probably the other side of the universe from Rio de Janeiro, which is very, at the time, very homogeneous, very conservative, very small.
Right.
So coming from, the whole world on the Rio beach to Williamstown in the snow was a bit like of a mind bend.
Yeah. But good education and a good
the
experience.
Education was amazing. Actually, I think because I was a bit of a misfit there, I was it was good in that sense. I did a lot of soul searching, and I studied like hell, I just, I know you're supposed to take 4 courses. I was always taking 6 courses at a time just to keep myself from trying to, cope with the bigger, growing up issues or something.
Right. And then what happened? After Williams, did you go straight into PhD studies?
No, I took a year back in Brazil after that.
Okay.
I wanted to go back. There were just stuff going on with family and things. I also wanted to be there for some difficult times in the family. So I spent a year there, but at that point, I had applied to graduate school, and I just deferred for a year, and then I went to Yale.
Yeah. The jump from here to Oxford, 1994. Just a couple of years back.
Yeah.
That was a big jump as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and what was your experience with England and Britain before that?
I mean, I had visited Europe, but I mean, I really was, I'm very much a New World girl from Rio, and so, it wasn't really part of my DNA in any way.
Right.
I ended up in England again for, vagaries of happenstance in life. I had a boyfriend at the time who was English and from London and wanted to go back. And so I thought it'd be fun to do a fellowship there for a while, and I'll see how it goes. So I ended up in Oxford, broke up with a boyfriend within the month, and then
life is peculiar like that, right?
It was very peculiar, and
divergences and
and it was I think one of the things that I most love in life is just learning new things, obviously in science, but also in terms of meaning of life and why are we here and perspectives, and so England was so different in many ways. And also the tone of the science was different. I think people were at that time more interested in some of the theoretical questions rather than the data, productivity.
Right.
And that resonated with me. So it was like it's been forever a trajectory of learning and change, and I've really enjoyed it there. And I can't really say I lived in England, because I lived in Oxford. Oxford is another
small
universe. Crucible of the universe, and I love that place.
Yeah. So going back home to Yale, a kind of a home, it's been a good experience, and navigating the re-entry into the US system is...
Yeah, it's I was very much like Oxford establishment, as you were kind of implying, and I have all my great friends there, and I kind of gave my blood and soul to that institution, and I still love it dearly. So I think when when we decided to move, my husband and I, it was kind of a shock to everyone, it was like, what? But it was really interesting because I'd been there for 30 years and I loved it, but I knew what was ahead, and as I said, I'm like a voracious learner and stuff. And when this opportunity came, other opportunities had come back and forth, but it was either something that maybe was interesting for me, maybe was interesting for my husband, but, we always kind of said, nah, we're happy where we are. But when Yale called, I was like, this was a special place for me. I'm the scientist I am because they really invested in me at those graduate student years, those such important years, and I had that loyalty to the institution. And then Luciano, my husband, who's a digital ethicist, he was like, I don't know, Yale, not really on the planet in my area, but it turns out that this was a huge priority area for them. So he was able to build all the stuff,
fantastic.
and lead. So it was a really interesting opportunity for both of us, and we kind of thought about it, and we're a little bit past our prime here. Are we really going to do this? And we're like, let's do it. Let's just do something new and adventurous. And then getting there has been amazing, but I try to say to people, because everybody who knows I've been there, it's like, oh, you've been here before. And I was like, it's not like that.
Yeah.
It's like I was walking around in Oxford and I opened a portal and I ended up in some other, parallel future in a slightly weird New Haven that wasn't the same as the one I left.
Right. You had quite some amount of time has passed too.
Yeah, it's been 30 years.
And you were
I was a different person. New Haven, has been much gentrified. Luckily it still has some rough edges, but it was like, it's a very different place than it used to be. So it feels in a way familiar, in another way really eerie and different, But the colleagues have been amazing.
Right.
People have been like so welcoming and generous and collaborative. It's been really fun.
Again, this might be a little unfair. Do you see a difference now 30 years later between, the system in Europe or in Britain particularly and what you've come back to or emerged back in, re-entered here in the US? Are the systems set up different? Are the motivations different? Are there good and bad components to that?
Yeah, I think they're in a way, academia is the same everywhere. We're a bit conservative, we're a bit entrenched. We kind of have creative and whatever souls, but we kind of get stuck in the academic machinery, and that's kind of the same everywhere.
Yeah,
but of course, there are like a lot of really interesting differences as well. I think one of the things, one of the things that's very similar between Oxford and Yale, which I like, is that there is kind of a collaborative spirit. So people across they're very loyal to the institution, and there's this idea of like doing things together and doing it as a team. It's a little bit, I think Yale has that reputation among the Ivies, or at least Yale thinks it has that reputation. Okay, I don't know from the outside, compared to some other institutions of really like doing things for each other together as a team and collaboratively. And I think Oxford also has that. People don't see it because everything is like everything's so distributed in all the colleges, the institutes, the centers, the things. But ultimately, if you ask anyone, hey, do you want to work on this project? They're like, yes. If you manage to get the connections going, things really synergize, and I think that's true in both places. But then I think the institutions are conservative in really different ways. Like the thing that has struck me in the U.S. is like the agony that people put into the recruitment, promotion of faculty.
Right.
It's just so cutthroat, so involved, to an extent that it's probably beyond what's necessary or even optimal. And I think it causes a lot of angst and work
Sets
for
up
everybody.
An incentive structure that's a little anti-science maybe, or a little anti-intellectual.
Well, I think that's one of the things that was exciting to me about coming to this particular institute at Yale. It's an institute that sits, outside of any of the schools or any of the departments. So it's kind of a free-floating institute right under the provost's office. So it has a lot of freedom there. And I think one of the things that I would love to do is kind of obviously push gently and nudge, see if we can change some of these academic incentives and help link our science to the world better. We do a lot of cool science in our labs, but if we think about the science of human behavior and science of the human mind, a lot of it is happening in industry and companies and tech companies and car companies collecting all these data and stuff. We need to find ways to partner and work together across academia and non-academic sectors. So that's one of the things that I think is kind of pushing against that conservatism is going to be hard, but it's something I'm really determined to try to do.
Next challenge.
Yeah, I'll just be annoying people that way.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question. I really appreciate all the time you've taken with us. I mean, you brought up Luciano, your husband, and I wouldn't normally ask about somebody's significant other, but it's very meaningful in this case because he's also an academic and he's a philosopher working in this digital ethics. And I mean, certainly I have a sort of fascination about, like, what's the conversation at the dinner table like,
Yeah.
I mean, have you found that, being married to a philosopher, or has he found being married to a neuroscientist, that there's been cross-infection of the way you guys think about things?
Totally, yeah. I think that's been so mutually enriching both ways, I mean, first we kind of like, we were a bit at loggerheads at coming, at things from really different perspectives.
Yeah.
But I think Luciano has, I mean, first of all, he has kind of a really deep knowledge of, like, history of science, but also history of thought and philosophy and stuff.
Right.
And it's a great to have like a gold mine like that, where you
Sure.
can bounce ideas off. I usually have a great idea and he says, oh, Epictetus said that. And when I'm like, oh, okay, of course. There's always someone who's,
Right.
But that's just really fun and useful. But I think we've converged and changed a lot together.
That sounds wonderful.
The usual, the morning conversation, I'm not a morning person, so the morning conversation usually goes that Luciano brings me coffee. He brings me coffee in bed. And he knows that for about 30 minutes, he can just, say all these like heavy philosophical things, because I'm not ready
You're
yet
not
to
registering.
fight back. So he would wake up and says, Kia, I think I finally figured out a way to separate meaning from truth. And I'll go, oh, okay. Where's the coffee?
Where's the coffee?
And, so it's the conversations are they go all over the place, and it's been, but I know that this is not like the most important contribution, but as scientists, we're sometimes quite sloppy at how we use concepts and words and things, and I think having someone who thinks
There's a
about
very high degree of precision.
Yeah,
about
he used
that,
words as like
construct.
very, very sharp tools and things.
Yeah.
Really helps the thinking as well.
That's
So it's
very
been
good,
And we actually just published our first paper together.
Very good, right?
Like I don't know, I think it's just out 2 weeks ago or something.
Excellent. On everybody's reading list. Now, I said I had one more question, but I do have one more burning question, which I happen to know is the question that the cognitive neuroscience community wants to know the answer to.
Oh dear.
You are Ana Cristina Nobre. Where the hell does Kia come from?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's easy. So in Brazil, maybe like in Ireland, everybody is Anna something or Mary something.
Yes,
so this
indeed.
is a very Christian
including
kind
the boys.
Yeah, exactly. So the Anna didn't really count. So it was like Christina was my. And then Christina in Portuguese is Cristina. It's quite hard to pronounce, and so it's like. It's not a word like...
So it has a hard K on the
well,
front
like Cristina, it's like... So I think it was like the first child who was born after me would just call me Kia. And so there was just like a family name. It just
so that's where it came
forever,
from.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we know. Now we know the origin of it.
Kia. But my name is causes endless problems with Anna, Cristina. Do you think I should change my name to Kia Nobre?
No, okay. I think you've got the mystique of the Anna Cristina and Kia is very important. Thank you so much for being
thanks,
here.
John.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks for all the hard questions.